Your bike still starts, it still runs, but lately it just feels tired, like the throttle is lazy and the idle hangs way too long after every stoplight. Cold starts are getting rougher, and your fuel economy keeps slipping. On a lot of high-mileage fuel-injected bikes, that lost snap can come from throttle body deposits, intake leaks, or sensor issues long before the engine itself is actually worn out. The difference between a cheap fix and a $1,000 shop bill often comes down to understanding one part that nobody talks about enough. Every fuel-injected motorcycle has a throttle body, and its job is deceptively simple. It meters the air flowing into the engine. That's it. But that single job controls everything about how the bike feels in your hands. The ECU watches the throttle angle along with intake pressure, engine speed, and coolant temperature to calculate exactly how much fuel to inject on every single combustion cycle. When the throttle body is clean and the sensors are reporting accurately, the math works perfectly, and the bike responds the instant you move the grip. When that system becomes compromised by dirt, corrosion, or a drifting signal, the math falls apart, and the bike starts making decisions that feel wrong. Think about what is happening inside that aluminum housing at a mechanical level. The throttle plate is a precisely machined disc sitting in a precisely machined bore. When you close the throttle completely, the edge of that plate seals against the bore wall with very tight tolerances. That seal is what defines closed for the entire fuel injection system. The gap between the plate edge and the bore wall at idle is measured in fractions of a millimeter. And that tiny gap is what allows the exact right amount of air to sneak past for a stable idle. When carbon deposits change the shape of that gap, even slightly, the air volume at closed throttle changes, and the ECU baseline shifts without anyone telling it. On many late 2000s to mid-2010s, Japanese sport-oriented inline fours, you are dealing with a dual butterfly setup. Your right hand controls the primary throttle plates through the cable, and the ECU controls a secondary set of plates to smooth out the airflow and fine-tune fueling at different RPM ranges. Suzuki called their version SDTV, and similar systems showed up across Kawasaki, Yamaha, and Honda sport models from the same era. It is a clever design that works beautifully when everything is clean. But it also means twice as many internal surfaces collecting grime that you cannot see with the airbox bolted on. So where does that grime actually come from? The biggest source is oil vapor drifting in through the crankcase ventilation system. Every engine produces blow-by gases that get routed back into the intake, and those gases carry a fine mist of oil that settles on everything it touches. Over thousands of miles, that film builds up on the throttle plates, the bore walls, and the edges where the plates seal against the bore when the throttle is closed. Combustion blowback adds another layer of fine carbon soot on top of that oil film, and heat cycling from stop-and-go riding makes the whole situation worse, especially on short trips where the engine never gets hot enough to cook the moisture out of the intake tract. Long storage is the final ingredient because it lets all of that wet residue dry into a hard, bonded varnish that does not wipe off easily. None of this happens overnight. It takes years of riding and thousands of miles before the buildup gets thick enough to actually change how the bike runs. But once it does, the symptoms are incredibly specific and frustrating. The first thing riders usually notice is a hanging idle. You pull up to a red light, close the throttle completely, and the RPM stays at 2,000 for a few seconds before slowly dropping back to normal. That happens because carbon deposits around the plate to bore seal are physically restricting how the air behaves at that critical edge. The engine control unit, or ECU, sees an airflow pattern it does not expect at closed throttle, and the idle control strategy gets confused. On some bikes, the idle hunts up and down during cold starts while the engine control unit constantly readjusts, trying to find a stable operating point that the dirty hardware will not let it reach. The second symptom hits you at low speed. You are crawling through a parking lot or filtering through traffic, and you roll the throttle open a tiny amount. Nothing happens. Then you open it a fraction more and get a sudden surge of power that you were not expecting. That dead spot, followed by a surge, is the direct result of compromised airflow at the exact throttle opening where fine control matters most. The ECU is calculating fuel based on what it thinks the air is doing, but the dirty throttle body is delivering something different than what the sensors report. This starts affecting you as a rider in ways that are hard to put into words. When the throttle response is unpredictable, your right hand starts making constant micro-corrections just to keep the bike smooth through a turn. Your brain never fully relaxes because the connection between your input and the bike's output has a delay in it, or worse, an inconsistency. Mid-corner roll-on gets sloppy, tight, low-speed maneuvering becomes exhausting, and long highway rides wear you out faster because you are working harder for a worse result. A healthy bike should feel predictable and repeatable at small throttle openings, especially in traffic and during mid-corner roll-on. When that feeling disappears, riders almost always blame the engine. They assume the compression is down, the valves are out of adjustment, or something expensive is failing deep inside the motor. Some riders spend hundreds of dollars replacing spark plugs, fuel injectors, and oxygen sensors trying to chase down that missing snap. But the reality is often much simpler and much cheaper to address. The irony is that the part causing all the trouble is sitting right there in plain sight, bolted between the airbox and the intake manifold, quietly collecting grime mile after mile. But the throttle body is not the only suspect in this lineup, and understanding the next part explains why so many riders fix the wrong thing first. Now, the throttle body does not work alone in this story. There is a small sensor bolted to the side of it called the throttle position sensor, or TPS. And this is the part that every backyard mechanic loves to blame, but almost nobody actually tests correctly. The throttle position sensor has one job. It tells the engine control unit exactly where the throttle plates are sitting at any given moment. Closed, half open, wide open. The ECU uses that voltage signal alongside all of its other inputs to decide how much fuel the engine needs right now. When the throttle position sensor is working correctly, it sends a smooth, clean voltage sweep from closed to open with no dead spots, no jumps, and no dropouts. When it fails, which does happen occasionally, the signal gets erratic and the ECU starts making genuinely bad fueling decisions. But actual hardware failure is far less common than people think. What happens much more often is that a dirty throttle body changes the airflow characteristics enough that the ECU's response feels wrong, and the rider blames the TPS because that is the first thing that comes up in a forum search. Or the throttle position sensor connector has developed corrosion, a loose pin, or that nasty green crust that grows inside plugs left in damp environments for years. The signal degrades, the engine control unit gets a noisy input, and the bike acts up. But the sensor itself is fine. This is exactly why swapping a $70 throttle position sensor on a hunch, before checking the connector and before cleaning the throttle body, is one of the most common wastes of money in motorcycle maintenance. The sensor gets blamed for sins committed by road grime and neglected connectors. And the rider ends up with a new sensor that reads perfectly, bolted onto a throttle body that is still filthy, wondering why the bike does not feel any better. If you are learning something from this, hit like, subscribe, and share with those in need. The cleaning process itself is where a lot of well-intentioned riders create brand new problems. There is a reason this part of motorcycle maintenance has such a bad reputation online, and it is not because the job is inherently difficult. It is because riders bring the wrong mindset to it. They see a dirty throttle body, mentally compare it to cleaning a carburetor on a lawnmower, and go in with the same level of aggression. But a modern fuel-injected throttle body is a precision-machined component with tight tolerances and sometimes protective coatings on the bore and plate surfaces. It is not a rusty carb float bowl. The temptation is to grab a can of whatever solvent is sitting on the shelf, hose the inside of the throttle body down like you are fighting a grease fire, and scrub until everything looks like polished chrome. That approach will ruin your weekend and possibly your throttle body. Aggressive solvents can strip the specialized coatings that some manufacturers apply to the bore and plate surfaces. Drowning the intake in liquid pushes cleaner past seals and into sensors and vacuum ports where it has no business being. and obsessively scrubbing the dark ring where the plate meets the bore can actually damage the sealing surface and create an idle air leak that was not there before you started. That last one is especially painful because you end up with a bike that runs worse after the cleaning and you have no idea why. The smarter approach, and the one described in virtually every factory service manual, is controlled solvent on a cloth, gentle wiping in layers, and knowing when to stop. The critical area is that thin band right where the throttle plate edge sits against the bore wall when the throttle is fully closed. That is where idle and off-idle response lives. And even a small amount of carbon buildup in that ring can change how air sneaks past at low openings. If a deposit is soft and comes off easily, it needs to go. If you are down to a thin stain and having to use real force, that is the signal to stop. The secondary butterflies on dual butterfly setups deserve the same gentle treatment. They get dirty in different patterns because they move differently and sit in a different part of the airflow path. And the actuators that control them are precision electronic components that do not appreciate being forced around by someone who just wants to see what is hiding behind them. After a proper throttle body service, the results are usually obvious on the very first startup. Cold start idle settles faster because the ECU is finally seeing a cleaner, more stable airflow signal. The snap test, where you blip the throttle and watch the engine speed drop back to idle, gets noticeably crisper. That hesitation where the needle used to hang at elevated engine speed before slowly dropping is gone, or at least dramatically reduced. The engine falls right back to idle, like a spring snapping into place. Out on the road, the change you actually care about shows up in the first 5 minutes of riding. The dead spot at low throttle openings shrinks or disappears entirely. Parking lot maneuvers feel smoother because your inputs finally produce proportional responses, instead of that infuriating nothing, nothing, nothing lurch pattern. Low-speed roll-on in city traffic becomes predictable again, and the transition into engine braking stops feeling like someone flipping a switch. That overall sense of the bike being on your side returns, where the connection between your right hand and the rear wheel feels direct and honest instead of filtered through some invisible layer of lag. For riders who have been living with a sluggish bike for months or years, that first clean ride can be genuinely surprising. Not because the bike gained horsepower, but because the horsepower it always had is finally being delivered the way the engineers intended. But cleaning isn't always the whole answer on an inline 4, and this is where a lot of YouTube advice falls short. If the throttle body service helps only a little, the next suspects are throttle body synchronization and vacuum leaks. 4 individual throttle bores that are slightly out of balance with each other will cause uneven idle and rough low-speed behavior that no amount of cleaning will fix. Each cylinder needs to be pulling the same vacuum at idle, and if one bore is slightly more open or slightly more restricted than its neighbors, the engine runs unevenly, even though every individual component looks fine on its own. That's a synchronization issue, and it requires a set of vacuum gauges and a methodical balancing procedure to resolve. Vacuum leaks are the other invisible culprit. A cracked intake boot, a loose vacuum hose, or an O-ring that has gone hard and brittle can let unmetered air sneak into the system between the throttle body and the cylinder head. The engine control unit has no way to account for that extra air because it never passed through the throttle body or any sensor. So the fueling goes lean on that cylinder, the idle gets rough, and the symptoms perfectly mimic a dirty throttle body. Knowing where the throttle body ends and those other problems begin is what separates a rider who fixes things from a rider who keeps chasing the same symptoms in circles. The throttle position sensor also needs attention after any throttle body service, but not the kind of attention that involves loosening screws. Some bikes need a simple idle relearn procedure after reassembly. Others need a model-specific adaptation reset through a diagnostic mode or a scan tool, and some just sort themselves out after a proper warm-up cycle. The exact procedure depends entirely on your year, make, and model. If the service manual does not specify a reset, do not invent one, and if it does, follow it exactly. Guessing at throttle position sensor adjustments or engine control unit resets is one of the fastest ways to turn a bike that ran a little rough into a bike that will not hold an idle at all. If your high-mileage bike has been feeling half asleep and you have been assuming the worst about the engine, take a closer look at the part that controls every breath it takes. The throttle body is one of the least glamorous components on a motorcycle, but when it gets ignored long enough, it can make a perfectly healthy engine feel like it is ready for the scrap heap. Drop your bike model and mileage in the comments and tell me the one symptom that has been driving you crazy. If you want more of this kind of engineering breakdown without the shop bill markup, subscribe so you catch the next one.